Welcome to Speaking Freely with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Hoover, your host and Director of Communications at the ACLU-PA. The annual cannabis holiday 420 isn't what it used to be. What was once a day of countercultural actions has gone mainstream, but we recognize it nonetheless, especially since there are still big issues to tackle in cannabis policy, including the fact that upwards of 20,000 people are arrested per year for marijuana possession in Pennsylvania, disproportionately Black Pennsylvanians. For our annual 420 episode, I talked with Brian Brown, a cartoonist based in Philadelphia and the creator of the comic strip Legalization Nation, which is a syndicated documentary comic that delves into news stories related to cannabis. In our conversation, Brian talks about his own history as a consumer, including being arrested as a teen, why being a registered medical marijuana patient in Pennsylvania has radicalized him, and how his cartoons make these policy debates accessible for readers. Brian has written and illustrated several books, including the New York Times bestseller Andre the Giant, Life and Legend, and Cannabis, the Illegalization of Weed in America, which tells the history of marijuana prohibition. You can find him online at boxbrown.com. This conversation was recorded on April 3rd. Well, Brian, thanks so much for joining the podcast and being here as we acknowledge the 420 and the annual cannabis holiday. I want to get into how you combined your interest in cannabis with your talent for cartooning. But before we get there, let's first talk about your journey with cannabis. You are a registered medical marijuana patient in PA. You've also been in the criminal legal system for a weed arrest. How did you get from 16-year-old kid arrested for marijuana possession to cartoonist telling the story of cannabis?
It was quite a journey from those two places. So, I got busted for smoking a joint at a baseball field when I was 16. Very wholesome thing, I think. Coming of age story.
It's as American as apple pie.
Yeah. And I got to see the legal system a little bit from that perspective as a teenager. The first thing I noticed, which I was like furious about, was that the person I got arrested with, who was a woman, a girl, we were 16, got not as bad of punishment as I had got, and we were arrested at the same time for the same charge. She actually had an extra charge that I didn't have. And she, it was very similar, but like she had to pay the fine. I had to pay the fine. She did not have to ever see a probation officer or anything like that.
Interesting.
I had to see a probation officer for 6 months. I got drug tested weekly, and was able to witness what it's like to be on probation in Union County, New Jersey, in the late '90s. Which was kind of scary for me. I was like this super nerdy kid, and like all the people, a lot of the kids in probation were like would probably kick the shit out of me if they saw me like in school,
Right.
But it was scary for my parents, I think, because it was like if I had got in trouble again and during that time period, there would have been these like repercussions and all these different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was scary, going to see a judge, getting drug tested. Um, that's just like, I was just like so nervous. I remember I had to like chug water every Wednesday, like after school, like start chugging water until I got to probation, and you have to like pee in a cup.
Mm-hmm.
And I was grounded. It was just like this, a difficult time for me as a teenager. And I remember like looking up at that was like the moment that broke my brain, because I was like, why? Like there's kids in my school, my high school, whatever, that got busted with like a keg last weekend, and they just like called their parents to come pick them up.
Mm-hmm.
But if I got caught with this thing, which is like less dangerous, the whole argument that goes on in your head where you're like, it's less dangerous, like all these things, but why is it illegal? And just like I think that's when I was like, it kind of like made me more interested in cannabis, getting
Yeah.
arrested. Um, so that, that was like my first foray into like understanding the history of cannabis. And it came from like being arrested for it. Otherwise, I probably just would have been like never even thought twice about it and just like smoked weed at parties and things like that. Um, anyway, fast forward a bunch of years later, I started making comics. Um, for probably like I worked on mini comics and stuff for like 10 years probably before my first book came out, which is a biography of Andre the Giant. And it ended up being a New York Times bestseller. It was like a huge hit book like that I haven't even come close to doing again. Um, but it
We'll
was,
put in a plug for oh shoot, the history book, Cannabis, the illegalization of marijuana.
yeah,
I have the
illegalization of
title.
weed in
There it
America.
is. I was gonna say I have
Um,
the title written down. I just need to find it.
yeah. So then, the third or fourth book that I did was this book about cannabis, the whole history. I think like when I first started thinking about, I think a lot of people at first, when you start thinking about why cannabis was made illegal, it was like, oh, people in the early 1900s were kind of like ignorant and they really thought it was like hurting people and blah, blah, blah. And the reality of the situation is like it's the same thing as it ever was. It was made illegal to allow the state to kind of enforce power over other ethnic communities, basically. I mean, like that's like most of the story.
Right.
There's other things going on too, but like from the beginning, the first laws, the first cities to make it illegal. It's like El Paso, Texas was like before state laws. The city made it illegal, and it was so they could punish they could keep Mexican people out,
Right.
basically. And so it snowballed from there. It was always like this racist thing, and then you look at like Nixon and the entire like Controlled Substances Act is like based on racism and so like that, knowing all of that, and then watching legalization come across the country, I had been to like California and seen these stores and being like, oh my God, this is like the future. Like this is we're living in the past. There's like all these stores everywhere. It's so great. All the weed's like really fresh. I'm in like Washington, California, Portland, and like all these weed stores are great. I mean, they have every kind of product stuff we don't even have in the East Coast, like all these different strains, all these great things. And then I'm watching it come across the country. It's like Colorado, California, and then starts like coming this way,
Yeah.
right? And New Jersey legalizes medical weed, and then Pennsylvania legalizes medical weed, and I'm like, oh wow, we're gonna have like a dispensary. Like I'm like, holy shit! I'm like reading all about it. I'm like, oh my god, they're building a dispensary like in our neighborhood. Oh, this is great. And then they opened up, and the prices were like sky high in the beginning, like way more, like double, more than double, like anything I'd ever paid for any amount of weed.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
before you go
so
on, I
go
want to
ahead.
quote, I want to quote you here from an interview I read. You told greenstate.com, I became a Pennsylvania medical cannabis patient and the system completely radicalized me.
Yeah.
So go on, say more
Yeah.
about why it
So this is what
radicalized you.
happened. This is what I think happens to a lot of people. It's like a common story now, where, finally I saw the prices were coming closer to not equal or lesser, but like closer to what the illegal market had. And I was like, you know what? If it's an extra 10, $15, uh, it's legal. You know what I mean? I'm like, I want to be legal. I want to go to the dispensary. It's just, I've been to these dispensaries in California. It's great.
Yeah.
So I get my card, whatever, go through that whole thing and go to the dispensary, and then the first day you go in there, you're like, wow. You're like, intoxicated. Before you even get the weed, you're intoxicated because you're like, wow, this is so great. It's got a menu, it's got all these different products, vapes, and we don't have edibles, but capsules and all these different things. And first time or two you go there, you're like trying everything on the menu. It's kind of like I don't know if you ever, when you were in your younger days, like worked at a restaurant, or like I used to deliver pizza and stuff, and
I
it
worked
was
at a
like
grocery
that.
store. I don't know if
Right.
well,
So like,
actually, so here, check this. I worked in the produce section at a grocery store, so I know where you're going here. Go on.
so like we would, so like at first, you're getting this food for free, so you're like trying everything, and then you're like, great, blah blah blah. I'll try all the food. Then after a while, you're like, I hate all this food. Like I can't stand it. I've seen every aspect of them making it. I know where all the ingredients are. Like I've tasted everything in the kitchen and everything. Even if you gave this to me for free, I wouldn't even eat it because I hate it that much. That's like how much I'm working at this pizza place, whatever. And that kind of happens at the dispensary where you're like, all right, I tried everything on the menu. Nothing has knocked my socks off here. And I paid 10, 15 bucks extra like per product, which adds up really fast. Then you're paying an extra 50 to $100 that you'd normally spend every time you're going. And so and then you're like, well, I'm just gonna get it from the dude I used to get it from 2 months ago because like it's cheaper. And like now that dude has a menu and shit, and like you know what I mean? Like that. So what happens is people go in, and then they get the novelty of it out of their system, and then go right back to the legacy market, which if it's like a place like New York or New Jersey, let's say right now, where it's legal, that's like a lot more cover for the legacy market. So it's not like they're gonna just like go away on their own volition, or something in the law that's like gonna make the only thing that's really gonna put the legacy market out of business is to be out if they're outsold or out competed by the legal market.
Right.
That's really like basic economics. Like you can't sit there, you can't ever, and they tried this for 90 years to punish the black market, use force to force the black market to stop
Right.
running. It's just not, it's never been successful. The only thing that's going to be able to, that's going to replace that is a functioning, competitive, legal market where those people that are, it's worth their while, those people that are in the legacy market, it's worth their while to be part of the legal market.
Yeah, I mean, and the comparison is often made to alcohol. No one is buying off-label alcohol because the stuff that you can get in the stores is the highest quality stuff. So
yes, and there's tons of competition and selection too. It's not like
right.
it's not like there's 4 alcohol companies anymore.
Right.
I mean, it kind of used to be that limited selection of beer and things like that. But like it's just like that too, where um, when it was a limited market, um, there wasn't as much competition. It wasn't as good. And then
Right.
as more competition came in, there's way more. Like now, there's like 8 trillion different kinds of beers you can choose from when you go to the grocery store.
Yeah. And that's just the IPAs. Never mind.
Yeah, exactly. So many.
Everyone's making IPAs now.
Yeah.
Well, some of what you're referring to and talking about is impacted by policy. And I know you live in Philadelphia. It's pretty clear from your cartoons that you're paying attention to what's happening with cannabis policy around the country, especially in the Mid-Atlantic region. And like I said, some of what you're talking about, we're starting to scratch the surface here about public policy and how it affects the market. What are your concerns right now about the direction of cannabis policy?
So, a few years ago, let's say, when Massachusetts legalized, let's say, they ran into, they're trying to, in the East Coast, like on the West Coast, they kind of started from a different place with
Mm.
legalization, right? In California, when they first legalized, home grow was part and parcel of the legalization process. Because guess what? There was no legal weed to get anywhere else. You had to grow it yourself.
Mhm.
Or there was no like stores that were like, no, you should be able to buy it from our store. It's like, no, that you have to make it legal. You have to make home grow legal. You have to make growing cooperatives legal. Like all that stuff has to be a thing. So in the California and a lot of the West Coast and a lot of Colorado, all of that stuff, all of those laws came from like the Prop 215 approach, which was like this medical approach that prioritized access for patients at and not profits really.
Mhm.
And then, so by the time Massachusetts legalizes in like 2015 or whenever that was, um, now there's like a lot of companies with a lot of money that have a lot of say in how things are going to go in that legalization process.
Yeah.
And Massachusetts itself has a lot of ideas about how they want to bring in the money for this and protect people and legalize the right way and all these different things and not make the same mistakes that they made in California, in
Mhm.
Colorado. Meanwhile, they have the best system still. Um, and so this is where we start seeing this extreme over regulation in the adult use markets. The medical markets, the extreme over regulation started like right away too. Like in New Jersey, their medical market, they were the first ones to be like, this is going to be grown by five companies only. You're going to have to buy it from these 2 dispensaries that are state licensed. That was the first like heavily regulated medical corporate program. Things changed
Mhm.
after that. That changed everything because then people were like, oh, you can legalize and make it like not this cool legalization that people actually want. You can make it like this thing and you can satisfy them and not piss off these people or whatever it is for whatever reason. And so you get this now influence of these huge medical cannabis companies, and they are able to go from state to state being like, listen, we set up we are part of this program in New Jersey, we could do it here in PA. Then you have the PA program, which is started out as like very few corporations running the whole system, and it's grown to now like 22 companies running the whole system, which is still nothing, and it's all like you know 19 or something huge corporations, which have also merged also now too. So it's shrunk in
Mhm.
that way as well. Um, and Florida looks like that too. And, a lot of other, Connecticut looked like that before they legalized, and they have legalized adult use. So after that medical thing happened and they started legalizing for adult use, you started seeing these laws that were like made it impossible for the little guy to get into the business.
Yeah.
And in Massachusetts, they had to change so much of their licensing process around to make it more advantageous for small businesses. But even still, and it's been years since Massachusetts legalized, and even still, they're just now kind of small businesses are just now kind of like coming online, and it's been dominated by corporate weed for a really long time. Um, it was really expensive despite even besides the licensing part, it's really expensive. Um, and in Massachusetts, real estate's really expensive. New Jersey's going to go
Mhm.
through the same exact situation because it's like that there too, where real estate's expensive as hell all over the state. Um, and so and so ends up being so much red tape. Massachusetts and New Jersey too gave the local municipalities too much power over it basically allows local municipalities to discriminate against cannabis businesses
Right.
and say, for whatever reason, because I'm the Republican mayor of Toms River, New Jersey, no weed will ever come into Toms River, New Jersey, ever. Even though we are the gateway to the beach for like tens of thousands of people, and in our town we have a ton of liquor stores, a ton of vape shops, head shops, but no weed. But it allows and that complicates the whole process as well. And in states where they don't do that, where they don't allow municipalities to discriminate, there's so much more small business involvement. Oklahoma, New Mexico, those are basically the two states that I know of that don't allow local municipalities to opt out of cannabis. And they have, they're growing at much fast. Oklahoma's huge already, but New Mexico is new, but it's growing really rapidly. So those are big things because, even in California, like 70% of municipalities opted out of legal weed, even in California. And it happens all over. New York, it was like 63% opted out. But I mean, I guess it's coming down a little, but most of these cities are opting out, and the cities that opt in, a lot of them are there to also take their piece of the pie. They're going to be like, oh, well, to operate in our city, you have to get the city license also, and you have to follow these specific regulations here, and we're only allowing one business in our entire city. So like, it's not, if you don't get the license, that's it, you're screwed. There's so much against it, you're so up against so much starting any small business. But there's so much more with cannabis. It's a totally unique situation.
Yeah, it is putting the squeeze on the market and making it, which ultimately impacts consumers. I also feel like listening to you talk a little bit about this reminded me of what we were talking about at the very beginning of the conversation, which is your experience in the criminal legal system and how so many people on an annual basis, perhaps as much as 20,000 per year in Pennsylvania, are arrested for possession. And that, depending upon how the laws are written, folks who might know some things about cannabis could end up being squeezed out of the market if they don't have capital, or if there's a law on criminal records that keeps people out. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that the thumbs get put on the scale in favor of big companies, which then lead to, downstream effects, particularly that impact consumers.
So much. There's so much that happens because like there's so many unintended consequences. It's like, you look at a state like Oklahoma, like I was talking about before, they have pretty lax regulations, and it allows for the business to grow huge. And the criticism a lot is that because those regulations are lax, there's a lot of black market activity going on but really the black market activity in California says the same thing. There's so much black market activity. And Oklahoma is the same thing, where there's tons of black market activity. But the reason there's tons of black market activity in Oklahoma and in California is because there's states around them where it's not legal. All that black market weed in California isn't going to Californians. It's going to states where it's illegal. And all that black market weed in Oklahoma is not going to Oklahomans. It's going to Texans, which is right there. You know what I mean? Like that whole southeastern area can be supplied because those surrounding states problem. Really, they're the one, because they're not legal and don't have a legal market. They are making the states where it is legal, putting them at risk, really. I mean, because that's now people are gonna there's reason to start an illegal grow because there's so many illegal customers still.
Well, and I don't know the data on Pennsylvania and where dispensaries are. Maybe you know, but I can imagine. Like I'm here in South Central PA, right outside of Harrisburg, and there are
Mm.
numerous dispensaries here in our area. And so, if I lived in northern Pennsylvania, if I lived somewhere, north of State College, getting up toward the New York border, I could imagine it being a cannabis desert, and you would have a legacy market because if municipalities have the power to keep businesses out, it would be easy to imagine seeing hundreds of miles or going hundreds of miles across northern Pennsylvania without being able to buy legal weed.
The other, yeah, and the other thing about northern Pennsylvania, if you're close enough to the border, you can just go right into New York, buy
True.
your weed, come home, which is what people would be doing in Pennsylvania if New Jersey had any good weed at any reasonable price in their legal market.
Right,
Um,
right,
I would drive over the border and get weed if it was good and if it was or if it was affordable. It's
right,
neither of those things right
right.
now. And I think, not there's a lot of obviously New Jersey is like the kings of red tape, but there's a lot of red tape in the New Jersey market. But one of the big things about New Jersey that makes it hard to open up is that there's like no affordable real estate in this
Mhm.
whole state of New Jersey. Whereas in Pennsylvania, I could see people setting up their grow operations in somethingburg, Pennsylvania, like that northern Pennsylvania area where you don't, someplace I never heard of, where it's cheap. You know what I mean? Where it's cheap to buy land, and
Mhm.
that's where New York has the advantage of that too because it has upstate New York. I mean, a lot of places can be growing up there where real estate is cheap, and selling it in the New York City market, which is amazing. That's really what could be happening in PA too. Is that if you're growing it out in these spots where there's a workforce that needs to be working and supplying it to the big cities where and the rest of the state too, but the big population centers, which is a huge market for a state. You know, Rhode Island has a really great market, but the entire population of Rhode Island is like half of Philadelphia.
Right,
Like, so like they have a great market. It's a great place to visit, but if you're setting up there, you're trapped. You know, in Rhode Island, you're limiting your customer base so much.
right.
At least until those border walls come down and stuff starts shipping across the country.
Yeah. I'll have to fact check myself and go back and see what the medical marijuana businesses are in northern Pennsylvania, if there are any, because I
There
don't want to miss.
probably there
Go ahead.
probably are around, anywhere population centers are, there are for sure. Because like I've been to like Reading and seen them around, or like
Hmm.
Scranton area has some, but
Yeah,
yeah, there's probably places I'm sure where there's like nothing really close,
yeah.
and it'd be difficult to drive. You can't grow your own cannabis here. In Nevada, they had a rule where like you could grow your own cannabis if you were more than 25 miles away from a dispensary,
Huh.
which is
Um,
funny.
yeah. I want to ask you about your cartoons. So this
Mhm.
fascinates me because as a comms person and advocate, I'm always thinking about how to explain our issues to folks in ways that are accessible. I work with a lot of smart people who can write thousands and thousands of words about civil liberties. My comms colleagues and I then have to figure out how to present those ideas in ways that our audiences can understand. So, what was your inspiration for cartooning about cannabis? These are nonfiction cartoons about what's happening with cannabis policy and stories related to cannabis. It's not Stone Charlie Brown. So, why did you start doing this?
Um, I did it. I started doing it, like I said earlier. I was radicalized by the Pennsylvania medical cannabis program, and I was like, okay, well, why is it so bad here? Like, what's going on? And the first thing you notice is that there's only 6 companies or something at the time selling weed,
Hmm.
which means the market's not good. Um, and then I started digging deeper and digging deeper, and then I was like, I'd be like reading about this. I'm like, did you know that like this company only, it runs in all these states where there's only like no competition basically. Like, and I'd start learning about this stuff and I'd be like typing it on Twitter and just being like, are you seeing this? And people would be like, no, it was hard to explain really. People were like, what are you talking about? Like, just smoke the weed. Like, but it was like, I was getting so worked up every morning about it that I just was like, it's a way for me to process the information myself in a way. Like I tell it to myself in the form of a comic and kind of like get my thoughts straight about it. But I like get this like immense satisfaction of like by like exposing all these different things because it's like I feel like what we're getting here is like a front row seat at like American style corruption. Um, we're used to the concept of like there being like two soda brands and like whatever, like we don't even care. It's not something we think about because it's that type of soda war thing and the growth of Coca-Cola and Pepsi happened a long time ago. Like we don't even care. And or know about it or understand it. It's so far beyond our comprehension at this point. Like Coca-Cola is a global brand, like but with cannabis, you're getting to see it like from the ground up. Like they're starting. This is the first day this law has happened, and there's tons of missteps and um, all kinds of people with all kinds of agendas influencing all kinds of parts of the market and the laws in good, in mostly bad ways. There's grifters and there's uh, all different kinds of weird grifts. There's the anti-cannabis grifters, and like there's these. One of the most humorous things I got to see, I think, in cannabis was, um, uh, what's that guy that wrote the? Uh, it was an anti-cannabis book called "Tell Your Children." Alex
Okay.
Berenson, right? This guy, Alex Berenson, cannabis. He was like, he basically rewrote um, uh, that old movie from the 20s,
Reefer
anti-cannabis,
Madness.
Reefer Madness, but for a 2016 audience or whatever that book came out. And it was the same shit regurgitated over and over again. And it was so silly. And even and I actually when my book came out about cannabis, I did a comic for the New York Times, and they objected to some of the wording in it. And where I was like, cannabis is now widely accepted as a therapeutic substance, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, well, what about this guy, Alex Berenson's book that says it's not therapeutic? Like, maybe we should reword this. And I was like, that guy's a quack, dude. Like, this is what we're really, the New York Times is still using reefer madness to give the message out.
Yeah.
And also then after I felt vindicated because afterwards, first of all, COVID happens and Alex Berenson becomes the most famous anti-COVID, anti-science COVID dude. um, and then he found out about I like had talked about him on Twitter a little bit, and he found my tweets and found out about my book, and he was like, oh, ha, 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 ha. My enemies are so stupid. They make comic books. Ha, 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 ha. It's just like so silly.
Was he twisting his mustache while he
Yeah,
was saying
yeah. It was just like this such comical thing. And then, months later, I see him as like the top anti-code, anti-masker and all that whole thing, anti-science stuff. Um, but that also that experience was like, well, we can't, I don't see anybody in the media actually covering this issue seriously. Like every single, it's the same thing I see in comics all the time where it's like, hey, did you know that like comics aren't just for kids anymore? And like, this has been going on for the entire like 20 years of my career. Like, it's always has this stigma surrounding it that it's just like, this is a medium for children, blah, 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 immature people. Cannabis kind of has the same thing where it's like, this is a silly thing for silly people. not us, not, something that serious people could ever use or care about. So a lot of the articles reflect that. It's a lot of very silly puns.
Yeah.
Your plans all went up in smoke.
Right,
Something,
exactly. Yeah.
all kinds of things like that. So I really felt that this was something that I had to do, like, or that it was a hole in the media market or something where, there's really nobody in major media like at all, and very few people in even cannabis, in small cannabis, because it's like this activist kind of position. A lot of cannabis is has gotten, people I think a lot about cannabis in the 70s, where like everyone was an activist and everybody said legalize it, man, all that stuff. And now there's a lot of people in cannabis and involved in cannabis and influential in cannabis that like don't have your best interests in mind at all.
Mm.
You know, they want it to be a certain way. They're just there to make the most money out of it. You see it. I wouldn't even be talking about it if I didn't see it all the time.
Hmm.
Like it's just like the majority of people are like that. And so like I just felt like people would like to see something that was like taking it more seriously. The comics audience, my readers, I think, and comics readers have come on this journey with me. They're willing to learn about cannabis legalization, even if they're not into weed because they're fans of Box Brown or whatever. Um, but um, I think for cannabis people, sometimes it's kind of, they're like, what even is this? Like, I've never seen anything like this. And the comic strip people, like my syndicate also syndicates like Popeye and like other like newspaper strips. So like when
Okay.
the strip runs on their website, the comments are really funny because those people really are like, what is this? This is not funny. Where's the joke? Like,
The
this is
people who
the
think,
worst comic.
right. They love Hagar the Horrible, and
Yes,
they
exactly.
can't understand your
I
strip.
don't understand it at all. But thankfully, like my editors at the syndicate, like they get it. Like they understand the importance of it. Really, they were like really great champions for me at first when I first started. And I was like, maybe I'll just send it to this one editor. I'm like, I don't know who's going to run this or whatever. But it's been slow and steady with them, but they editorially have given me a lot of freedom and recognize that this is kind of like a new thing that could be important.
Yeah, well, and I first became aware of your cartooning and your comic Legalization Nation because you did one about our mutual friend Chris Goldstein and
Oh
how
yes.
Chris was explaining something to a state senator and basically just hopped on the phone and broke it all down for him.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
so that was a good one. But just curious, any particular favorites of yours that you wanted to highlight? I have another one in mind, but I wanted to give you the chance to
Um,
say it first.
I think one not that long ago talking about the Curaleaf Roman Abramovich connection
Hmm.
was I got a good response, I feel like, from the audience, and I felt like I was in kind of a unique position to write a comic about this because I illustrated a book that was a biography of Vladimir Putin, and it was written by like a Putin expert that is a um, Russia expert and advisor to presidents and things like that. Like he wanted to make a comic, and I illustrated it, so I got to have this one-on-one uh, interactions a lot with this Putin expert. So I got to know a little bit about how these things work from that perspective. And so doing that, I was like, wow, I'm really pulling my Russia knowledge into this thing. It was like,
Hmm.
and I think people don't really understand the only thing about that I think people don't really get is that when you say oligarch in Russia, you're not just talking about like a rich person in Russia. It refers to like a specific group of people that basically stole all of the public goods from the Russian people at the end of communism, which is not that many people. It's like a handful of people. And then
Right.
one of them is this guy, Roman Abramovich. So it's basically like this guy and all the other Russian oligarchs that in this regard are like, they stole the whole country from Russia. Like that's how they got so wealthy. So it's not the same as just like, the way people call Bill Gates an oligarch or something like that. Like, it's something else. And that's why that connection between that guy and Curaleaf, the biggest legal cannabis company in the world by market share, is a big deal. And like, it's not just like, oh, some rich Russian dude funded them. It's this guy, like it's like one of Putin's capos or something. If we're talking about like the mob,
Right.
it's like Paulie Walnuts.
Right. Right. The one I wanted to point out was the one that you did about and this crosses a variety of issues that ACLU works on, which is the gentleman that was killed by the state police.
Oh yeah.
And when he was run over by a bulldozer. The story, as I understand it, is that a couple of guys were growing a few plants in a state park. The law enforcement became aware of this, and in the breathless pursuit of a guy growing a few plants led to his death because they tried to clear the land with a bulldozer, and he was there when
it was a guy that was he had like an issue with his leg, like he had like a limp, like a cane or something, and he was hot. They were there tending their plants, and the cops showed up, and they like hid in the brush and stuff. And they just kept bringing out the cops, more people, more equipment. They had a helicopter, everything, looking for this guy in the brush. And finally, they like commandeered a bulldozer and to drive through the brush and ran the guy over with the bulldozer. This is over like 3 plants, like, and this was after they had medical cannabis in Pennsylvania as well. And there was another, a more recent one too. Not where the guy died, but a guy got busted in Western PA for having a grow tent in his basement, and he ended up getting charged with, because they found a kid's toy in his basement. They charged him with the felony of growing cannabis, but also the felony of committing a felony in front of a child. So his kids got taken away and stuff. And this is like it was like last year, I think, when this happened. So we're talking about like 2022, where X amount of states allow you to grow cannabis in your house. There's still people getting sent away and at big expense, losing custody of your children. That's a huge deal. Breaking up a family like that, that's enormous. That it's like, you're not just harming the person who committed the offense. You're harming the whole family, the children, everybody. Yeah. Way more than the plant in the basement ever harmed the children, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, and these two stories speak to the thing that we beat the drum on all the time, which is we have to get marijuana out of the criminal legal system. We can talk for days about what a legal market should look like, but to me, and I say this probably every year when we do this episode for 420, getting rid of criminalization and removing cannabis from the criminal legal system has to be priority number one for these two stories, and there are countless stories like that.
Right, and I think that those two things do not have to be the same law. It does not have to be. You could pass legalization, decriminalization, where you stop arresting anybody, and then take all the time you want to develop whatever legal market you want. And no one's being arrested anymore. That gun is not to the people's heads while they're negotiating the weed law, the sales laws, all this like because that's like irrelevant to people getting arrested. Right. That whole thing where which is a huge problem, where huge corporations are taking over the whole markets and blah blah blah. They're the ones that are actually using the arrests of 30,000 Pennsylvanians or whatever it is to push through all these horrible things that benefit them and harm consumers and small businesses. And if you just took that out of the equation, where you're like, oh, there's no arrests, no one's getting arrested,
Right.
then you can negotiate a deal on the same footing.
Yeah.
And they did that in Vermont, and Vermont's rollout of legal cannabis has been very good, I think.
We talked earlier about your book, Cannabis, the Illegalization of Weed in America, and you talked a little bit about the history of prohibition. Is there anything about that history that you think informs the move to legalization today? I mean, you talked a little bit about the racial impact. Are there other things about that? When you were working on that book, did you learn things? Was there anything in particular that you think is helpful knowledge for us now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the what we talk about now a lot with social equity and social justice reforms, like the people forget about that stuff a lot, because over the excitement of being able to buy weed legally and stuff, that type of stuff, you forget about the expungements. And because I think if you know the history, you're looking at legalization not just as like this party, but you're righting a 90-year wrong. It was always wrong. There was never any point where anyone was acting in good faith to protect anyone. It was always about arresting people and oppressing people. And so when you think about it from that perspective, like, how could you ever tarnish the process by which it becomes legal? Like, it is such a great injustice that it is owed to all these people that died in prison over cannabis over the last 90 years, and all of the people whose lives have been impacted. Gregory Longenecker, this guy who's got a felony, are just two of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a century, whose lives were destroyed, upended, over this cannabis plant. And so when we talk about legalization, it has to be it's righting a wrong. It's not an opportunity for growth. It's not how you're going to solve your tax burden. You are fixing, you're fixing a right. You're making a historical step to fix a century-long wrong. It's wrong, and so, but it's become, it's gone so far from that first Prop 215 law, which was basically there for AIDS patients. Really, it's so tied to the AIDS movement. And it was about compassion for AIDS patients who are dying. And what it's become is such a farce, and it's silly, and like, the concept of medical cannabis has been so bastardized, and all of this. It's a shame, but like I said, it's very common in every single sector, every part of the United States. And so getting to see it from a grounded eye view, like from the beginning, is like a unique perspective.
Well, Brian, you've been very generous with your time. Where can listeners go to see your work?
You can check me out on my social media. My Twitter is Box Brown, and so is my Instagram. I run my comic there every Tuesday on both of those sites. It also runs on comicskingdom.com and greenstate.com. And if you're in Tulsa, it runs in the print edition of the Tulsa Weekly. So check it out there. And also check out my Patreon, which helps keep the lights on a little bit over here.
All right, Brian, thanks so much. I really appreciate the conversation and everything you offered. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Brian Brown for the conversation and his insights. You can find Brian's work online at his website, boxbrown.com, and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle at boxbrown. That's BOXBROWN. By the way, I did fact check myself about the locations of Pennsylvania's medical marijuana dispensaries. According to weedmaps.com, the northernmost storefront dispensary is in Brookville in Jefferson County. That brings episode 79 to a close. The editor of Speaking Freely is Natalie Montero. Our opening theme is by Moody Finn, and our closing theme is by Elliot. Both are courtesy of bensound.com. The acting executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania is Claire Landau. I'm Andy Hoover. Until next time, be free.